Hello, so I'm here to give you a quick overview on issues that you should be thinking about if you're going to be hiring people in India or having to fire employees and actually managing your workforce out in India. There's a lot to think about and a lot to get through, so I'm just going to pick up some of the salient issues. The first thing I tell my clients always is before you even begin to hire, fire or manage employees, you must understand the environment you're operating in. Understanding India in its totality is very important, and very often, unfortunately, HR issues get pushed to the side or are taken up independent of perhaps the discussions in the boardroom, the corporate structure and so on. And that for India can be a big issue. So what I urge my clients very often is that if you are in charge of HR issues or looking at hiring and firing, you are sort of engaged in the discussions with your corporate or legal team to understand the structure that's being put into place, so you can understand what you are allowed or not allowed to do from an HR perspective. So that becomes very important. The second issue is employment law on its own really cannot be understood without tapping into and understanding the implications of tax obligations, liabilities, regulatory restrictions, and immigration implications. So again, before you even start thinking about HR-related issues, you must understand the environment relating to these other areas. Also, a quick understanding of where Indian employment law is today. Unfortunately, Indian labor laws have not kept pace with the liberalization that India has seen in other areas of legislation and business. All of our legislation is quite dated and hasn't kept pace with liberalization. Again, to understand the context in which it was put into place, it was meant to be there to redress the master-servant inequality, to try to deal with, uneven and unequal playing field. So that is what a lot of foreign companies will have to grapple with when they're in India, and understanding what legislation applies to them and how what they need to do to remain compliant. Again, talking about key concepts, understanding what law applies to you, and that is a good starting point to understand what is it you're doing in India, what industrial sector you are related to, how many employees you have on the ground in India, because a lot of legislation has numerical caps. So if you're under 10 employees, legislation may not apply to you. If you're above 20, again, legislation may apply to you. So how many employees do you have across your different offices in India can have an impact. Also, Indian law is sort of quasi-federal in that employment laws are both federal legislation, so central legislation would apply to you, but also state-specific legislation. So again, it's very important to understand which cities in India you're operating in, and that will have an impact on, sort of how you set out your contractual arrangements with employees in different cities. Also, a very unique concept under Indian law is the categorization of employees. Employees pretty much fall into one of two categories. Your employee might be considered a workman or not a workman, and this term is a bit misleading. It's nothing to do with blue-collar, white-collar workers. A non-workman, that is the exception, is someone who is in a managerial or an administrative capacity, or working as a supervisor and earning about £200 or more a month. Now, again, these terms have not been defined under law, and a lot of the legislation is, a lot of the interpretation is based on case law as to who may qualify as a workman and who may not. The reason it becomes very important to know what your employee, which category he falls into, is because workmen enjoy statutory protection over and above non-workmen. One of the key pieces of legislation under Indian employment law is the Industrial Disputes Act of 1947, and that really is your Bible for Indian employment law as it applies to workmen. All disputes, all disciplinary procedures and so on would all be dealt with under this act. So again, as a key concept, as a key takeaway, when you're employing individuals, you need to be clear, and your contractual document must clearly indicate, which category an employee falls under. And if, in case of doubt, then, the employee would benefit from an interpretation that he is a workman and not excluded from statutory protection. So this becomes very important, when you're crafting your documentation together. Going on quickly to sort of hiring employees, again, the situation in India is slightly different in how you would approach the hiring of employees. The whole process is steeped in a lot of the cultural idiosyncrasies that surround India, which I'll talk about in a bit. But just sticking to the actual sort of legal framework, yes, you have a written contract of employment that you would execute with your Indian employee. What causes a lot of confusion is a lot of individuals expect to have offer letters which aren't properly crafted employment agreements. And very often I find clients tend to have several pieces of documentation all dealing with the terms and conditions of employment, which can get very messy. And of course, if you have to take any action, that's the time when it can come back to haunt you. So making sure you have a proper, well thought through, well crafted employment contract becomes very important. Also, using a bog standard UK template doesn't always work in an Indian context. Again, there are sort of various aspects and that do apply and can be used and incorporated. But one key difference, for example, is the treatment of non-compete clauses. Under Indian law, restricting an employee from earning a livelihood, which is a constitutional right, would be treated as invalid and unenforceable. So what do? How do you actually stop an employee from leaving your employment, going to a competitor, taking all your know-how and working with that competitor? A difficult proposition, and definitely one that you cannot succeed on if you have a bog standard non-compete clause as you know it in the UK. The way to deal with it is to link the non-competition issues to the term of the contract, so you achieve a sort of result very much akin to gardening leave in the UK. But again, India doesn't recognize the concept of gardening leave. So if you have that clause in your agreement, neither the employee nor your manager in India would understand what you're talking about. So again, Indianizing your employment contract becomes very, very important. Similarly, with terms and conditions, you need to be very cautious that you actually are meeting the minimum requirements that are stipulated under state legislation. So if you have an office in Hyderabad and one in Delhi and one in Mumbai, the chances that you will have to tweak your agreement to be slightly different in each of those states is very high, because the provisions for leave, holiday, annual leave, sickness allowance all vary between states. Again, to be wholly compliant, you will need to make sure that you actually abide by the local state legislation that is required. Employee handbooks again cause some issues for clients. It's very important to make sure that your staff handbook is appropriate for use and is valid and enforceable in India. There's no point having extensive data protection policies which all rely on the UK Data Protection Act, because you can't bind an employee in India working for an Indian subsidiary company to UK legislation. We don't have our own data protection legislation in place just yet. So what do? One example in that case is you actually interpret the act, the UK Data Protection Act, as part of the company policy, and in the contract of employment, you make it a condition for the employee that they will abide by company policy and abide by all the obligations of the data protection policy. So hence it becomes very important also to actually make the employee handbook a part of your employment contract rather than just as a standalone document. Yeah, that's a very good question. And until a few years ago, immigration was really not an issue. People went to India willy-nilly as they liked, or whatever visa category they chose to, no questions asked. But since we had our own 9/11, the terror attacks in Mumbai, a lot of people don't realize, but those were planned by individuals who were also running an immigration practice out of Chicago. And suddenly the spotlight got onto Indian immigration and why are people coming in, and hence this rule of even tourists entering India cannot re-enter for 2 months without specific permission. So to answer your question, we now actually have very clear guidelines on what constitutes employment-related activity and what constitutes business activity. And depending on what you're going to be doing, you need to go on that category of visa. Also, the interesting change now is it doesn't matter if you're going to India for just 1 day, you may still need an employment visa. So the timelines no longer are an indication that, oh, well, I'm in India just for 1 day, so a business visa would be fine. So you have to be very clear about what you're going to do and why you're in India. Yeah, with SMEs, I think they're both in a sweet spot and a hot spot because they know there's a good market out there and they can engage with counterparts easily. On the other hand, they don't always have the resources to go the whole hog on due diligence, on finding the right partners who can help them very often. So when it comes to recruitment, I think making sure they have reliable sources from which they can source talent, and also reliable individuals who they can go back to if there is a problem. The whole issue of recruitment of staff is not specific to SMEs itself. I think even multinationals face the same issue. Where do we get the best talent and how do we source these individuals? The question really is, India is still coming into its own with recruitment agencies. They don't really exist, or they're trying to come into their own as we know them in the West. And especially when it comes to middle and top level management, it's much more word of mouth and it's much more about relationship oriented. So it's taking the time to go out and build those relationships. The other quick point I'd like to make as a caution is with SMEs, very often the need and the urgency to do business is there. And very often they come across an individual in their travels who they want to actually block for their own operations, rightly so. They don't want to lose that individual. But in their haste, they end up signing an employment contract between the UK PLC and the Indian individual. And that is opening up a Pandora's box, because suddenly they may inadvertently create a permanent establishment without a structure in place. There may be tax obligations, there may be liability issues. So even before they trigger that, they need to stop and think, okay, I found a great person, I need to block them. Should I be entering into a consultancy arrangement for a short-term period until I can get them onto my books as an employee? Now you're asking, okay, I think with culture, it's expect the unexpected. And just when you think you know all the answers, no, you don't. Especially with the business culture. I think, people go out to India expecting it to be either, interestingly, completely alien and completely different, and they come back pleasantly surprised. Well, people speak English and, they do business the way we do, or they go with such preconceived notions that they can be considered as being very arrogant and condescending because they've gone all prepared to talk down to people. So I think it's about preparing yourself and knowing that India sits somewhere in that middle belt. It's understanding that Indians love to do business, are open to business, but believe in relationships. So if you're going out to create a joint venture, if you're going out to actually find a distributor, don't get put off if someone asks you 20 questions about your personal life. Are you married? How many kids do you have? What's your dog called? It's all about small talk. It's all about getting to know each other. And that is about taking the time, effort, and making that first step towards building a relationship. I mentioned earlier in my presentation about hierarchy being very strong. It's also understanding that Indians understand it but also expect it. So if you are going in to meet a top honcho in an Indian outfit, you need to go in with a certain element of respect. If you're going to be meeting a bureaucrat, that person expects titles and pomp and ceremony. So again, it's understanding and preparing yourself on how to deal with individuals in India on the ground to get the best out of your visit and to get business success.